money is absolutely 100% a weapon. The perpetuation of US dollar stablecoins has the ability to move that Eurodollar quote unquote prison or make it even bigger. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. So I think the best way to explain this is
Brent Johnson is the CEO and founder of Santiago Capital, a San Francisco-based investment firm, and a seasoned macro strategist with more than 2 decades of market experience.
He is widely known for developing the dollar milkshake theory and is a frequent commentator on global macro currencies and precious metals.
the reason the United States is now embracing stablecoins is as a last-ditch effort to save the dollar and find new people to buy its treasuries. Now, I happen to think that that's ridiculous, and I think the real benefit or the real advantage is much more. There's going to be a big battle between the United States Treasury and the United States Fed. You can already see it happening. Ultimately, the Fed will be absorbed by the U.S. Treasury part. I don't think Bitcoin is going away, but
Hey guys, welcome back to Less Noise, More Signal. A warm welcome to Brent Johnson as well from Santiago Capital. It's very nice to have you with us on the show today.
thanks for having me. This will be fun.
Yes, thanks a lot for agreeing to come on. Yeah, I mean, I've been following you for quite some time. Very interesting takes on all things macro and then also stablecoins, which I got to read a paper of yours. You sent it along. I think you published it, I guess, end of October, as far as I recall. And I think you've done some other shows on it as well. So this is pretty much what I want to talk to you about today. A stablecoin report called Empire by Code, which is a very interesting title. I want to get into this, but maybe first, before we get into the report, there might be some people, especially from Europe and now from Switzerland, who might not be familiar with your work and who you are. So if you could quickly introduce yourself, that would certainly help.
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Brent Johnson. I've got a wealth management firm called Santiago Capital. I'm based in Puerto Rico now, but I previously spent time in New York City, like 25 years ago. And then I was in San Francisco for about 20 years and moved here about 4 years ago. So, I came up with my overall wealth management philosophy about 6 or 7 years ago, about the time I started my own firm. And that's what I've talked a lot about over the last 5 or 6 years. But most recently, I've started talking about the effects of stablecoins and how that, I think, will play into markets in the years ahead. If anybody's heard me talk before, I always kind of focus on the big picture. I'm not much of a details guy. Details are super important, but I leave the details to others, and I try to just figure out from a big picture standpoint what's going to happen.
Yeah, amazing. I guess that's what people very appreciate, listening to, because you get this big picture view, and a lot of people, I feel like, miss the entire forest for the trees, and you and others are really trying to make sense of what's happening, as you said, on like a macro level, which is very much appreciated, as I said. So, what is your initial motivation, or what was your initial motivation when coming out with this report? Maybe if you could sum this up.
Well, yeah, I think a big part of it was I was as surprised by the answers as I thought other people were. Stable coins are not new, and I think they've probably been around for close to 10 years. And I took a look at them probably 5 or 6 years ago. And I think probably the polite way to say it is the main company I took a look at, I found to be less than favorable in my eyes. Felt like they weren't necessarily up to the same standards that I was used to dealing with. And as a result, I probably just kind of pushed stable coins to the side and didn't think too much about them after that. There's also an angle that, I've always been of the opinion that where private markets can innovate and attempt to subvert the system will always fight back. Doesn't mean the system will win, but the system will fight back. And I felt like as these stablecoins developed, they would inevitably come into conflict with the powers that be, for lack of a better way of saying it. But over the last year, I saw things happen that led me to believe that they were not fighting back against it, and in many cases embracing it. And so that caused me to kind of go back down the rabbit hole. And when I did that, I realized that I had been missing some things prior. But not only that, but the fact that they are now embracing it gives them some advantages that the private market doesn't have. And when I finally saw it, it was kind of it's kind of like the Matrix. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. I felt like for me to really understand it, I had to write it all down and be able to explain it to other people. And so that's what led to the report itself. Whenever, I think this is probably not new to people, but I've always heard that if you can teach it to somebody else, then you probably know it pretty well. And I wanted to know it pretty well. So I had to try to figure out a way that I could explain it in as simple terms as possible, kind of using first principles. So I kind of built the whole paper around first principles of what money is and what sovereignty is and what power is and how they're all related. Because ultimately, I think money is an extension of power. And we can maybe talk about that because I see it from both. I struggle, and maybe you don't care about this, but I struggle often with what I would personally like to see happen versus the real world that I am forced to deal with. And it's because I struggle with it that I know other people struggle with it as well. So it's a big thing that I talk about over and over and over again, but I talk about it for myself as much as I talk about it for other people. I've had to train myself to do that. It's not easy, but I feel like this whole stablecoin thing is a mixture of all of that stuff put together. And so I really enjoyed writing the paper. I've enjoyed talking about it. It's fascinating to me. To me, it's kind of the intersection of money, power, geopolitics, sovereignty, individual freedom. I mean, it's really the heart of all of it. And so I think it's an important topic.
Yeah. Yeah, very well said. I mean, I can totally feel, what you're saying, because like I have these two souls in my chest as well, like, or in my breast. Like I told you offline, I was originally raised a libertarian Austrian economist guy. That's where I heard about Bitcoin way back in time in the US, actually. And so I have all these theories, and like personally, I still consider myself to be a libertarian. And then obviously there I have all these beliefs about how the world would work. But then I also feel like I'm in the real world. I have to be kind of like a realist, because things just often don't really work out the way I would like them to work out. And so I do really struggle with like, okay, how would I want the world to be? And then also just like how the world just is, and it might not be sort of in line with my thinking, and with what I see. So this is, I guess, a struggle with mostly the very honest libertarians, that they feel like at some point in their sort of career or whatever, when they keep on studying things, it's not as easy. It's not as black and white. So, and then this
That's right.
actually comes across in the report that you wrote, because I feel like you wrote this very interesting thing that money and power are inseparable, and if you are among libertarians and free market people, you can often hear money is a free market good. It's only this, and so are libertarians wrong in that sense, or how you square the circle here?
I don't think that they're necessarily wrong, at least not all the time. I think they're right from a free market perspective. And I think especially you got to understand, and maybe I have this wrong, but my general sense is, having grown up in the United States, that the United States probably more than other countries leans libertarian, right? Or at least leans towards the freedom of individual choice. And so that belief system is kind of built into everything that we know. It's the individual power. It's not, we as individuals have the right to tell the state what to do, not the state tell us what to do. And so I don't think that they're wrong. And in fact, I think it's incredibly important. And I should say this, but I had kind of an awakening, for lack of a better way of saying it, right around the global financial crisis. Luckily, it happened right before the financial crisis, so I kind of understood what was happening. But there was probably a 5-year period starting from 2007 to 2012 or 13 where I was just trying to figure stuff out for myself, because prior to that, I had just kind of memorized and repeated what other people who I thought were smarter than me had said, and I just parroted what they had said. And in that period of time, again, 5-year period of time, discovering the Austrian school of economics and embracing, I'd always kind of been libertarian, but, kind of embracing that belief system. I think it was critical for me to understand, to build a framework and to build a foundation of self knowledge and understanding of how things either work or can work. And I think it's important for anybody to understand that line of reasoning and understand that point of view. But I think you can also get too dogmatic in that point of view. So I think in the same way that the Keynesian system is very dogmatic, will oftentimes, dismiss the Austrian school. I think the Austrian school is sometimes guilty of those same things where they will dismiss the views of the Keynesian system. And the fact of the matter is, whether we as libertarians like it or not, Keynesian economics kind of runs the world. Now, maybe that won't always be the case. And maybe it hasn't always been the case. But as of right now, in the world that I live in and operate other people's money in, that is the case. And that's something I should say, related back to what I was saying earlier, the struggle I have, my personal feelings versus the way the real world is. I have to juggle an additional responsibility, and that is I'm managing money for other people. They don't necessarily have this, and I'm a fiduciary. So they don't necessarily share my politics. They don't necessarily see the world the way I do. And they didn't hire me to go out and be a social justice warrior and fight for libertarianism. They hired me to protect their portfolio and grow it. So I don't have the luxury of talking about how I would like things to be. I have to deal with the real world as it is. And so, I've had many discussions with Bob Murphy, who I think is just a fantastic guy. And I learned when I was going through this period of self-discovery, I read a lot of his stuff and I learned a lot from him. And so I appreciate all the work that he has done and continues to do. And I think people should listen to people like him. I don't think that they should necessarily agree every time he says something, but I think they should listen. And it goes for the same way on the other side. I think you listen to the people who propose that MMT is the solution and explain MMT. And I think they have some good points. And I try not to be dogmatic about anything. I think you have to have conviction, but you should not be dogmatic. I think is probably the best way to say it. And you always have to be open to taking on some new points of view. That was kind of a long answer, but hopefully that explains it.
Imagine lowering your tax bill while stacking Bitcoin. With Blockware, you can. Thanks to new tax guidelines, you can write off 100% of your mining hardware costs in a single year. Blockware's mining as a service takes care of everything, so you can start mining Bitcoin effortlessly. Visit mining.blockwaresolutions.com/LNMS and get $100 off for your first miner.
Yeah, no, for sure. No, I guess there's always a kernel of truth in all of the theories, just because, as I said, the world is not as black or white as people want it to be, and I am obviously younger than you, but I can only just say I experience the world the same way, from what I can tell. So I definitely, as I said, I can feel what you're going through in that sense. But again, maybe state and money, the power, money and power, like, can you flesh this out for us? How are they connected in your view? And I guess you can also go back to history, and there has always been a very tight grasp by the state over money in that sense as well.
Yeah. So I think the best way to explain this is I jokingly call it a fairy tale, and people always get offended when I say this because I feel like the libertarian or Austrian school will propose this fairy tale of how money came to be. And that is that, we started off where some guy had a fish and he needed a rope. So he walked around with a rope with this fish until he found somebody that wanted a fish, and he traded the fish for the rope. And then you took the rope and maybe you used it to make something. And then you took that, you found somebody, whatever you made, somebody wanted that and they gave you some milk. And this turned out to be this big barter economy. And then throughout that, eventually one good was more in demand than all of the others. And gold was that good, and gold became the most marketable object. And as a result, that is money. And that's how money came to be. I'm not saying that never happened, and I'm not saying that it couldn't happen. But I don't think there's a whole lot of evidence that ever happened on a large scale. But what I think is provable from history is that governments in some form or another, maybe it was just the chief of the tribe, Maybe it was just the biggest, strongest guy in town. Maybe it was the local, governor or lord, or maybe it was the king. There always has been some type of an hierarchy in our society. And you had to kind of abide by that hierarchy, or else you would be shunned and you would be thrown out of the group. And the reason people joined those societies and followed those rules, because if they didn't, survival was very difficult. So being shunned was in many ways put to death over a long period of time. And so the idea that in a hierarchical system, and where the strongest typically have told the weaker what to do, whether that should be the way or not, that is history, is the strong telling the weak what to do. It's hard for me to sit there and say that the littlest, weakest guy had this money, and so the biggest, strongest guy didn't, had to listen to everything he said. To me, that just doesn't square with logic, and it doesn't square with my reality. So I think in a system where there was no top-down government, then I think the Austrians have it completely correct. And so I think that probably did happen from time to time. And I think governments, when they sprang up, they probably adopted, in many cases, what the free market had already chosen, because it was easy. It was easier to choose what the market had already decided on its own rather than impose it from the top, right? But I think there's also evidence, and there's different monetary. I mean, you can go all the way. You can go to slavery. You can go to feudalism. You could go to socialism. There's many different ways where money is what the sovereign demanded in return. And I think that whereas the Austrian school would say that money derives value from its unique properties, satisfying this double coincidence of wants and, the most marketable, token. I think, a government could provision itself just by spending the money into existence and saying, I'm going to pay you this token to provide milk to me. But at the end of the year, you have to give me some of those tokens back in form of tribute. And because everybody needs those tokens to pay the sovereign in tribute, or else they end up in jail or worse, then all of a sudden those tokens have value. I know that's kind of that's heretical to many Austrians. I totally get it. I understand why, but to me, it's also real. And so I can see how both systems could develop, and I think there's truth to both sides. But when I look at the world today, every political jurisdiction that I've been able to find uses fiat currency. Now, that doesn't mean that gold doesn't have value. It doesn't mean that gold can't be a money substitute, but gold doesn't currently satisfy debt. It doesn't currently act as a medium of exchange. Doesn't mean that it couldn't, but it just currently does not. And so to me, it's not money right now. I personally would like it if it was, but it's just not. And so I have to accept that. Or I think if you don't accept it, then I think you're fighting against reality, and reality is probably going to win that battle. So that's kind of how I see it, and I think it's important to embrace both sides, or at least understand both sides. I think situational awareness, that's the term that I have used. Understand where you're at, and then the environment in which you're operating. Because if the biggest, strongest guy doesn't agree with what you say money is, your money loses value very quickly.
Yeah, I know, definitely. How is it that then stablecoins relate to this? Because like on one side, they're on public ledgers, and these ledgers are sort of from the private rails and have been upheld also, by unknown people through these nodes and stuff. So they're sort of on the private side, and they are decentralized, even though some people argue that some of the ledgers are not. But then you always have people who want to drive adoption of stablecoins on top of Bitcoin, which would then entail again that it's on a decentralized public ledger. But then again, you have like centralization, because like most of these, like at least like the important fiat stablecoins like Tether, like Circle, they are highly centralized. It's companies that are behind them. And ironically, they're backed by US treasuries, which is again something that crypto wanted to bring to his knees in the first place. Yeah, how do we think about stablecoin in that context?
Well, like I said at the beginning, probably the reason I didn't initially embrace them, or at least continue to look into them, is I thought they were in conflict with the state, right? And I didn't like the companies that but with the passage of the Genius Act earlier this year, and when they were talking about it over the last year, that's when I started to think, well, hold on a second. The state is not actively trying to crush these things. And in many ways, they're trying to partner with them, or at least, and if they're not partnering them with them, they're considering adopting their innovation or technology. And that's when I started to think about if the government used it from their perspective, rather than just trying to regulate it and letting the private market run it. Was there a way that they could co-opt it, so to speak, and run it themselves? And that was rather, when I started going through that step-by-step process, that's kind of when it kind of hit me like a ton of bricks that I had been overlooking the true power of the stablecoins. The reason I think stablecoin, and then I should say, I think all of the recent focus that stablecoins have received, at least that I have seen, maybe there's other analysis out there that I just haven't come across yet, but has been on the fact that the reason the United States is now embracing stablecoins is as a last-ditch effort to save the dollar and find new people to buy its treasuries. Now, I happen to think that that's ridiculous, but that is out there. So let's just address it. I think that even if that is the case, I think that is probably a second or third order of effect importance of stablecoins. I don't think that is the primary benefit to the United States as a government. And I think the real benefit or the real advantage is much more, I guess I would say, surreptitious and a much bigger advantage. And that is, I think it is a way to dollarize. The big buzzword for the last 10 years has been de-dollarization. I think stablecoins actually have the ability to do the opposite, and that is to dollarize the world rather than de-dollarize the world. And I think when that happens, this goes back to power and money being inseparable. If a foreign currency starts to circulate within a political jurisdiction and become the preferred means of exchange and even store of value, the local currency starts to lose value very quickly. And history shows us that when a government or a political jurisdiction loses control of the money, they lose control of everything pretty quickly. And that is, again, because money is a tool of the government. And that's the other thing. I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but all of this stuff is so commingled. It's hard to tell a linear story when all of this stuff comes at it from so many angles. Let me make one point really quick before I forget. From a government perspective, other than violence or the threat of violence, the biggest tool to influence behavior that any government has is money. And that kind of goes back to why they would want to control money. If you're a sovereign, it means you are not beholden to anybody or anything. You have absolute power. But if you are beholden to a form of money that you cannot control, then you are not truly sovereign. And every government wants to be sovereign, right? And so that is why I think governments have not embraced gold. That's why they have not embraced Bitcoin, so to speak, because they can't fully control it. But they can fully control their fiat currencies. And I think this US dollar stablecoin is a way for the United States to better control the dollar in the Eurodollar market. And it's also a way that foreign countries will lose control of their domestic sovereignty as the US dollar replaces their local currency. So I think that is how these are all related to each other.
Discover the power of self-custody with Bitbox, the hardware wallet that combines privacy, precision, and world-class security. Whether you are a beginner or an advanced user, Bitbox offers user-friendly features and advanced options like coin control or optional passphrases. I have personally been using them for years, and so should you. Visit bitbox.swiss.lnms and get 5% off your first order.
Yes, exactly. I want to come back to this point for sure, on how it's rivaling like these other local currencies all around the world. But maybe coming quickly back to this first point that you were raising, about this idea that is floating around in people's head that like the stable coins are now here, the harbor of the sort of a redeemer or a safety vehicle, you can save the US dollars and by buying up all these treasuries. When I hear or listen to you, am I correctly in assuming that, yeah, you really say, well, this is not gonna, it's not needed in that sense, because the dollar is not at the verge or on the verge of collapse and doesn't need to be saved. Obviously, it's great demand at the margin, and it will certainly help maybe in sort of driving yields, down on the short term or whatever. But it's not that it's really like something that is needed because the dollar is just fine in that sense.
Yeah, and so when I say the dollar is fine, this does not mean that it is a perfect store of value. And I think this is the mistake that many libertarians or advocates for hard money mistake, is that the US dollar is not competing with gold. It is not competing with a perfect store of value. It's competing with other fiat currencies that are extremely flawed. Now, the United States dollar has like an incredible number of flaws. And if you were to ask me, is it something I would like to hold for a long period of time? I would tell you no. But fiat currency is not designed to be a store of value. As I said earlier, money is a tool of the government. The government doesn't want hard currency. So the fact that it's losing value means it's working exactly as it is designed to do. You might not like the design. You might think the design should be different, but that doesn't mean the design is not working. It might not be working for you as an individual, but it's working for the government just fine. And the idea that the United States dollar is going to fail, but the Turkish lira is going to survive, or the Argentinian peso is going to survive, or the Chinese yuan is going to survive, or the Japanese yen is going to survive, while the dollar, meets its death, I think is just completely to misunderstand the nature of the competition between those. The United States dollar, from a fiat standpoint, completely dominates all other currencies, and it's not even close. So if you feel the dollar is near death, then you must certainly feel the yen and the euro as well. And so I think that's the mistake, is when people hold dollars, they're not holding it as a store of value. They're holding it as a mean of exchange and a tool of liquidity. And when you look at it from that perspective, you start to understand how these stable coins could be very valuable. And oftentimes, when we think about the dollar being a bad currency, it's probably somebody from the United States or maybe Switzerland, where we see our currencies losing purchasing power. But if you're from another country, an emerging country, whose inflation rate is much higher than the United States, and whose currencies, collapse and have less liquidity than the United States on a much greater basis, they look at dollars as a high yielding asset, as a great store of value. And in fact, if you look at some countries, you look at the inflation rate of some countries, and you look at the rate at which the US dollar has outperformed their local currencies, the dollar has in fact been a good inflation hedge versus their local economies over the last 5 or 10, 15 years. Now, again, I'm not arguing that the dollar is a great currency, but on a relative basis, it's pretty well, and it's pretty tough to beat. And so I don't think that the dollar is on the verge of losing the global reserve status anytime soon. I don't think it's on the verge of failure. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't own gold. It doesn't mean you shouldn't own assets. It doesn't mean you shouldn't own Bitcoin or some other stores of value. But on a currency to currency basis, I am not worried versus its peers.
Yes, I see. Interesting point. Maybe one last point on this. Do stablecoins increase the demand for US debt? Because I was always wondering, there's also this alternative argument, that these alternative currencies, today that are floating around and are maybe the blind among the one-eyed king, which is the US dollar, they are already backed by foreign reserves, mostly US dollar, So if these local currencies are then disrupted for US stablecoins, it's only sort of a reshuffling. And because in your paper, I think you all wrote as well that 60% of central bank reserves are already dollar denominated. And so I was wondering, what is your view there? Will this effect be as huge as people proclaim it to be, in that sense?
I think so. And you've seen a lot of charts this year showing the dollar's percent of reserves falling and gold's percent of reserves rising. That is largely, not completely, but that is largely a function of price. As interest rates have risen and treasury bond prices have fallen, that makes the percentage go down. And as gold has doubled or tripled over the last couple of years, that makes its percent go up without additional buying or selling being done by these central banks. Now, central banks have been selling some treasuries and central banks have been buying some gold, but it's not to the degree that is reflected in a lot of, or that is implied in a lot of those charts that are going around. And to your point, most central banks and even commercial banks around the world hold treasuries, U.S. treasuries as reserves. So if the U.S. Treasury were to fail, if treasury bonds were to fall dramatically in value or to fail, then that means those banks and those central banks are going to fail as well because their reserves are going to disappear. And if people then tell me, yes, but they've bought a lot of gold and the gold will revalue higher, okay, fine. Well, the United States has a lot of gold as well. And so if you're using gold holdings to say that your currency is going to stay strong, how can you say that the United States dollar isn't going to stay strong when they have more gold than it? And so I think any of these arguments that are made about the dollar losing status in the world or losing the global reserve currency denomination or, disappearing while the rest of the world continues to function, I think it's largely a myth. I don't think it's reality.
Hey guys, I'm thrilled to share my new book, The Bitcoin Enlightenment, co-authored with Mexican billionaire Ricardo Salinas. Make sure you grab your copy now and learn about how one of the richest people in all of Latin America thinks about Bitcoin. You'll find the link in the show notes.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, about the dollar having utility all across the world. I mean, we can really see this, And a colleague of mine had this great analogy when he said, like, because let's put it this way, among the Bitcoiners and like the critics of the dollar or fiat currency in general, they're quick to point out that it's like proof of violence, because as you said, there's power to money and the state has these like aircraft carriers, and they are somewhere all across the world. And so they can kind of force this currency on other people. And I guess there's probably some merit to this, but at the same time, there's also this other thing. And that's my colleague, he calls it the proof of value. It's this other V, and this is where the networks effects come in and then the liquidity that you mentioned. And I guess that's where stable coins come in because they really enhance this proof of value argument, or they just help spread the dollar in that sense to even more people who don't have a bank account. And so this is just, I think, very important that people need to understand it. It's not just about proof of violence, it's also about proof of value in that sense, right? And so that's where it's so powerful joining the US dollar and the stable coins.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, a currency is a network system, right? And the dollar is the biggest network in the history of the world. And it's not even close. I mean, everybody in the world, other than perhaps some lost tribe in the jungles of New Guinea, has heard of the US dollar and has probably held the US dollar in their hand. Any country you go to, you walk onto the street and you ask them if they know what the exchange rate between their currency, the US dollar, is, they will know. They might not know what the exchange rate of their currency to the Japanese yen is. They might not know what their exchange rate between their currency and the Russian ruble is, but I guarantee you they know what the exchange rate with the US dollar is. So that is because it's of this network that you're talking. And the stable coins have the ability to enhance that network to a degree that I don't think most people understand. And as that network is enhanced, the dollar becomes even more entrenched than it already is. And I think, and it does so in a way that is by, what do you call it? It's voluntary adoption. This is not the U.S. military flying over in a B-52 bomber and saying, you need to use a U.S. dollar stable coin or else we're going to drop a button. It's the opposite. It's the local merchant. It's the local person who says fiat currency is even worse than the dollar. I am going to hold on to the dollar. And in holding on to the dollar, they then perpetuate that B-52 that could fly over if it chose to do so. So it's a self-reinforcing system. and it's used by voluntary adoption. And in many ways, this will end very, very badly. But it might not end for many, many years. And what I mean by that is, in the same, I don't know if you've heard me talk about this before, but I don't think everybody fully understands the power of the Eurodollar market. So the Eurodollar market is the market for dollars that exists outside the United States. And that Eurodollar market is orders of magnitude bigger than the dollar market inside the United States. And that Eurodollar market is what provides so much demand for US dollars. This new system, this new stablecoin system has the potential to increase that Eurodollar system to an even greater degree, but not only increase it to a greater degree, give the United States more control over it. And the issue is that as the rest of the world was voluntarily building this Eurodollar system post World War II, they were building their own prison. And what I mean by that is they chose this is where the free market, and this is the ironic thing. Many free market, libertarian, Austrian school-minded individuals hate the dollar. Yet the Eurodollar market was chosen by voluntary participants in the free Eurodollar market. And it has just gotten to be so big now that it's really, really hard for them to leave, right? And so the perpetuation of US dollar stablecoins has the ability to move that Eurodollar quote unquote prison, or make it even bigger, and give the United States even more control over the keys to that system. And so it doesn't mean that it will end up this way right away, but over a period of 5 or 10 years, it could easily happen.
Yeah, I see. Help me also understand the connection or the relationship between, the stable coins and the Eurodollar market. Is it sort of an add-on in that sense, or is it going to eat into the Eurodollar market, or how is
Yeah.
the relationship between these two?
So to me, it's an add-on right now, but it could eventually completely replace it. And so right now it enhances the current system. But as this enhancement starts to become more popular and more liquidity starts to flow through the new plumbing as opposed to the old plumbing, it's only a matter of time, in my opinion, where all the liquidity migrates from the old plumbing to the new plumbing, at which time the old plumbing is no longer needed.
And why is this? Because stablecoins are more efficient, faster, or what's the reason for this?
Cheaper, more efficient, faster. That's the benefit to the private market. From the US government's perspective, they have more control over it. It's programmable. It's fully transparent. And so the fact that it provides the private market all of these advantages, which drives voluntary adoption, I would call it the Machiavellian state can sit back and just watch them adopt it and become addicted to it before they drop the hammer and say, now you're ours, right? To me, that's the genius of it. I said earlier, when they passed this Genius Act, I actually thought it was an act of genius, which is very rare for a government initiative. That's what I meant, because this is a way that the free market does the work for the government for them.
Yeah,
And
very
the
interesting.
rest of the world, and it's a way for the U.S. And this is going to sound dramatic, and I recognize that it sounds dramatic, but I also think this is a way for the United States to conquer many other countries without ever firing a shot, because the citizens of those countries will do the United States military's work for them.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So fascinating. So interesting. It reminds me of this quote by this French guy. I don't remember. He was active during the French Revolution. And he said something along the lines like, I need to figure out where my people are going so I can lead them. And this is exactly right, because
Yes.
the people are already going somewhere and they're adopting it. And then the US government can just sort of put
Yes.
its nail on top of it.
Well, and you can see, and listen, I've made this comment a few times in the last few weeks. And it is very true. And that is, you can see that other governments around the world are starting to figure out what these US dollar stablecoins mean. And they are terrified. And they should be. Because this, again, if you lose control of the money within your jurisdiction, you're not going to be in power for very long.
Yeah, I mean, digital euro is probably a keyword, that comes to mind here. I mean, this is something that we hear here in Europe every now and then, or more often. So, do you think this could be a challenger? Because I just maybe one anecdote. I feel I'm Swiss. I have most of my fiat in Swiss francs, obviously, but now being in the crypto and then also having worked on an international scale, and having received money through crypto rails, I happen to find myself having dollars, in a sense that I would never have otherwise, and so this is also, it didn't happen like purposefully or on purpose, but it just came about. And so if this were
Not
to
only that,
unravel, yeah,
you're in Switzerland, which has a very strong currency.
yeah, exactly.
Imagine if you're in Egypt, or imagine if you're in Bolivia, or imagine if you're, in Turkey, or you're in Sri Lanka. You're holding dollars as a Swiss citizen whose Swiss franc has outperformed the US dollar. It's one of the few currencies of the world that has outperformed the US
Yeah,
dollar.
exactly.
So if you are naturally coming by them in a country that doesn't really need dollars, imagine the proliferation in countries that do.
Yeah, exactly. I just feel like the more digitized this world will become, and this is sort of inevitable, the more these stable coins will spread, and the US dollar will be the prime beneficiary of this. So it is very interesting. You mentioned also controlling today's stablecoin system is easier than the old system. I think you referred to this also. You talked about the SWIFT system in your paper. So maybe if you could kind of elaborate here as well, why is it a better controlling opportunity, or why is it easier controllable, the
Yeah.
stablecoin rails versus the SWIFT system from the US perspective?
Well, so first of all, you have to understand this Eurodollar market that operates outside confines of the domestic US market is not under the political jurisdiction of the United States. Now, the fact that they are the United States and the global hegemon provides them some ability to influence it through influencing other countries, but it's not necessarily their domain to police. And the messaging system, or the plumbing through a lot of these non-US banks that provide this credit and send trillions of dollars back and forth between each other all day, every day. The primary conduit that helps them settle all these transactions is called the SWIFT system. The SWIFT system is not a U.S. institution. It's a European institution. It was developed as a consortium of European banks who started this whole Eurodollar market 50, 60 years ago. And so post 9/11, the United States used its political power to get some visibility in it and some control over it, but they don't have perfect control. And it's kind of an archaic, antiquated system. It's not a fully digitized, up-to-date, super technological system like these stablecoin technologies are. Not only that, but the traditional Eurodollar system and the SWIFT system, they could influence by, saying you're no longer allowed to use the system. They could sanction a country and say you can't use the system for certain types of transactions in these industries. But again, it's not a perfect system. And it's not, quote unquote, programmable in a modern sense. But these new stable coins, they are programmable. They do have perfect visibility if they're designed in a certain way. And by putting this Genius Act into place and kind of mandating rules via which these US dollar stable coins can operate, they are giving themselves, if not complete control, very close to it. Or at least they're giving themselves the option to have complete control. I haven't figured exactly out how they're going to do this. I don't know for sure that they have a current plan in place. But I think all the people that think that the United States is filled with government's filled with a bunch of idiots who don't know what's going on, I think that probably is a big percentage of them. But there's a handful that are pretty smart dudes, right? And that I know, trust me when I tell you that they know how to use these types of things. And money as a weapon, I should say this because I've talked to a few people about this and they always like question me on this. Like, what do you mean? Money is not a weapon. And let me tell you, money is absolutely 100% a weapon. You may not think of it that way, but a government does think of it that way. And perhaps they think of it as a blunt weapon. Perhaps they think of it as a scalpel. Perhaps there's different ways to think about it, but it is a weapon. And not only from a U.S. government perspective, but from a U.S. military perspective. If you look through their handbooks and their operational field guides, money as a weapon is an indoctrinated policy of the U.S. military. They know very well how they can use money to influence a military outcome. So the idea that the Pentagon doesn't understand this, or the U.S. Treasury Department doesn't understand this, or the U.S. State Department doesn't understand this is silly. It's very naive. Trust me, they understand this.
Yeah. I mean, from the viewpoint of a local currency like the US dollar, and now with stablecoins, it's a like a weapon of mass destruction, because they're going to be annihilated in that sense. And I mean, that's what I found so interesting when I talked to Paulo Adornio, the CEO from Tether. I had him on my show as well, and I asked him the question: isn't he being like sort of hated on by all these third country officials because he's spreading Tether all across the world? And what he said was quite interesting. He was like, no, sometimes they're even sort of welcoming this, because they feel like, okay, the US dollar is at least somewhat stable. And even though we might lose monetary policy, like possibly, the economy in that country might benefit in
So,
sense.
okay, so I wasn't going to say this, but since you brought it up, I'm going to make this point. And I can guarantee you there's going to be many people listening that are not going to like this point. But this is one of those hard truths that nobody likes to talk about, is that a lot of these countries, they are subservient to other countries. Not everybody can take on the United States. And so while they may be quote unquote sovereign in their own local territory, the bigger, stronger countries can tell them what to do, right? That's not nice. The world probably shouldn't be that way, but that's the way it is. That's the real politic of it, right? And so if the U.S. is going to kind of influence what they do anyway, to your point, maybe using the U.S. dollar at least actually helps their local economies, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And it solves some of their economic problems. Now, does it make them a vassal state of the United States? Yeah, it does. The way same Georgia's a vassal state of the United States, and Tennessee and Nebraska, maybe they're a new state that falls, it's not officially recognized as such, but from a practical standpoint, that's what they are. The other thing I would say is in many of these countries, those officials and those leaders and those politicians all have offshore bank accounts, and they're not stuffed with Russian rubles and Chinese yuan. They're stuffed with US dollars. And again, that's a hard truth. That's not something that people necessarily like to hear, but that is a matter of fact. And I have seen those in your country. I have stood in a room in Switzerland and looked at billions of dollars of shrink-wrapped currency that no doubt belong to some third world dictators and African, military juntas.
Yeah.
So I know for a fact that those exist.
No, to your point, I mean, I know Switzerland is a vassal state of the US as well, if you really boil it down. It was so obvious back with the Credit Suisse, and then also during the financial crisis with UBS and stuff there, we really felt it as well. So yeah, everything else is just maybe wishful thinking.
I will say though, not every country is just going to do what the United States says. Obviously, stronger countries are going to fight back. China has the ability to fight back to a much greater extent than Turkmenistan does, right? Russia has the ability to fight back greater than, Belgium, as an example, right? Just because of who they are. Switzerland has the ability to push back in ways that many other countries don't. I know this because I used to actually store gold in Switzerland. This is about 10 years ago. And one year, the guy called me up and he said, "Hey, you got to move your gold." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because we no longer want to comply with the rules that the United States is putting on us And if we have American clients, we have to comply with these rules. And he said, you're an American, you're out. He was very nice about it. And I understood, but we kind of had a good laugh about it. I was like, okay, I get it. But that's
Yeah.
an example. That's an example of Switzerland pushing back, right? And Switzerland has some other unique capabilities that the U.S. government probably wants them to be on friendly terms and stuff. But that is an example, and I would expect that stuff to happen going forward. So some countries will have the ability to fight back better than others. Some countries will dollarize quicker than others. But I think it's a big problem for weaker countries.
Yeah, for sure. And how do you think will bigger countries fight back? China, Russia, maybe the Eurozone. Will it be through a CBDC because they just don't the stable coins, are not proliferating outside of the US
Yeah.
dollar. So what avenues have they to go
Well,
down on, and is it CBDCs or something
I mean,
else?
number one, they could make it illegal, and they could say if we find that you're doing this, you're going to get a legal penalty, or you're going to get a financial penalty, or maybe you get thrown in jail. Um, but it's going to be really, really hard to police this perfectly, especially because it's online. And I think in some countries where the local currency holds up better than the local, stronger versus the dollar than others, maybe those won't get adopted as quickly. I would probably say, if you're in a dictatorship where it's easier for the president or the local power to just clamp down, maybe they are able to withstand it quicker and easier, just because they can enact, very harsh laws and reforms to keep it from happening. But ultimately, I don't think there's a whole lot they can do. They'll try, but I don't think there's a whole lot they can do.
Yes, I see. Interesting. Well, coming to an end here, I just wanted to ask you one more thing, in terms of we talked about all the benefits that are accruing to the United States if we see further US stablecoin adoption. Do you see also some drawbacks that the US will face from this? Anything that comes to mind?
Well, I think it's going to cause problems between the United States and some other countries. I don't think these other countries are going to like it. My guess is that the United States, well, it's not us doing it; it's the private market. They'll play in innocence. So that would be one part of it. The other thing is it will allow over time the United States to continue to drive up these huge debts, right? And while I don't think that's necessarily going to cause a problem in the very short term, eventually it will, right? You can't borrow money forever and ever and ever. You can borrow money for a very, very long time. And I think that runway is bigger than most people think, but that will eventually cause problems. The other thing is that as the, how do I explain this? As one of the drawbacks of the Eurodollar system. So one of the reasons the Eurodollar system is good for the United States is that it creates demand for dollars outside the United States. So the United States can run budget deficits, spend money money into existence, without having the absolutely horrible runaway hyperinflation result on its currency. So the Eurodollar market acts as a drain on the domestic inflationary effects of printing money. The problem is then when those dollars proliferate outside the United States, when a problem or when a credit crunch starts in the Eurodollar market, it inevitably falls back onto the US dollar market because that is the only place that can manufacture new dollars in base money. And so if you get a dollarized world or a further dollarized world, and then you get a dollar credit crunch in South America or Africa, that could cause monetary policy problems for the domestic United States. So it's not a perfect system. It doesn't mean that the United States is immune to any drawdowns. And I think that one would be one of the biggest ones.
Yeah. Have you also thought about what happens if domestically in the US, like US citizens hold more stable coins and maybe move away from banks, and then these bank deposits move to stable coins. So they might be hindered in their private credit creation, the banks, because they don't have the deposits anymore to finance and fund this, or
Now we're going down a whole other path, and we could speak another 2 hours on this topic. And this is one of the reasons, and now listen, I don't have this perfectly figured out, but I think the number of banks in the United States is going to dramatically decrease for some of the reasons you just alluded to. And I think as a result, there's going to be a big battle between the United States Treasury and the United States Fed. You can already see it happening. It's going to get worse. I think ultimately, I don't know exactly when or how, but I think ultimately the Fed will be absorbed by the U.S. Treasury Department. Whether it will remain its own functionary unit or not, I don't know, but I think those two will eventually get merged. But that in itself will be a big battle. I mean, you're battling over money. You're battling over the ability to create money. For all of history, governments have gone to war over treasure and money. And this is global seniorage. This is the ability to print money on a global basis. It's the single most powerful tool in the world, and there will be lots of battles fought over it.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's going to be so interesting because that's what I'm thinking as well. If private banks are being disrupted and then maybe they are, as I said, hindered in their ability to do private credit creation, then somebody has to fill in the void, and maybe it's the U.S. Treasury itself who will then create the money and try to disperse this out in the. It's going to be so interesting how stablecoins disrupt the entire system and kind of reorganize everything around them. So,
well, not only that,
very
but
interesting.
Trump came out and said we're not going to have a central bank digital currency in the United States. I think he's going to get around that by making it a Treasury digital currency rather than a central bank digital currency. But it's functionally going to be the exact same thing.
The exact same. Well, I mean, last question, because Bitcoin, I want to bring it up. Do you think from your point of view, like stablecoins are going to benefit Bitcoin or hurt it in any ways, or how's that relationship going forward?
Well, the first thing I should say is I don't think Bitcoin is going away, right? I think the days of it going to zero are probably gone. I don't know that for sure, but that's kind of my inclination. I'm not sure what this does to the price of. I can make an argument that this will actually help Bitcoin. I can make an argument that it will hurt Bitcoin, but probably just not smart enough to answer that question very, very well. And I think I'll just leave it at that. I honestly don't know. I've thought about this a lot, and I haven't been able to come up with a good answer.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's probably thinking as we go here because it's the same for me. It's like, as you said, there's like both ways I could argue as well, but it's just going to be so interesting in reality how the things will peter out or just like how they will kind of unravel. So, I think we're coming up on the hour here. So, Brent, thanks a lot for doing this. Very interesting thoughts. And as always, like no rosy words. That's what I like about you, and that's why I guess some of the people also listening to this will very much like this. So we'll link to your paper for sure, Empire by Code. If people want to follow you, I guess they can probably reach out on X or follow you on X or
probably the best way to follow me is if you go to santiagocapital.com. There's contact information. If you go to Twitter and look up Santiago Capital, it's a white seashell. The handle is @SantiagoAUFund. And then our Substack address is research.santiagocapital.com.
Nice. Exactly. Yeah, we'll link to all of this. This is amazing. Thanks a lot for doing this. So enjoy the rest of your day. And if you ever come to Switzerland again, let me know.
Absolutely. I will.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day.
Bye. Thank you.